I picked up a soaking old man on the road and got fired for it. What happened next turned my life upside down. You know those moments that change everything? The ones where a split-second choice sends your life spiraling in a completely new direction? I never thought picking up an old man in the pouring rain would be that moment for me. Let me back up a bit. My name's Kevin Parker. For the past 4 years, I've been driving a school bus in Millfield, one of those small Midwest towns where everybody knows your business before you do. It's not glamorous work, but the pay is decent, and I genuinely enjoy seeing the kids every day. Their energy is contagious, even on Monday mornings when I'm running on coffee fumes. My routine was comfortable. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., help my wife Sarah get the kids ready for school, and drop them off at my mother-in-law's place since their school starts later than my route. I'd usually grab breakfast at Dale's Diner, where they know exactly how I like my eggs. Our house is usually too chaotic in the mornings for a sit-down meal, then start my routes. Afternoons were split between my side gig fixing motorcycles and family time with our 2 kids, Emma, 9, and Tyler, 6. Sometimes I'd catch a game of friends at O'Malley's when Sarah took the kids to their grandparents'. Nothing fancy, but it was my life, our life, and I was content. Then Midwest School Transit, the company I work for, started rolling out new efficiency protocols. That's corporate speak for stricter rules and more cameras. The big one that had everyone talking was the absolute prohibition on giving rides to anyone not affiliated with the school. No exceptions. No excuses. Our supervisor, Natalie Robertson, called a special meeting just to hammer this point home. She's one of those people who smiles while delivering bad news, which somehow makes it worse. The liability issues are simply too great, she explained, pacing in front of us like a drill sergeant. Anyone caught violating this policy will be terminated immediately. No warnings, no second chances. I remember thinking it seemed extreme, but who was I to argue? Jobs weren't exactly growing on trees in Millfield, especially ones with benefits. So I nodded along with everyone else and went back to my routes. Fast forward to last Tuesday. It had been raining all day. Not the refreshing spring shower kind, but the cold, relentless downpour that soaks through every layer of clothing. I was headed home in the bus. We were allowed to take them home when we had early morning field trips scheduled for the next day, which I did. That's when I saw him. An elderly man, probably around 65, standing at the edge of the road, completely drenched. His thin jacket offered little protection against the elements, and he was hunched over slightly, clearly exhausted from walking in the harsh weather. I slowed down instinctively. In that moment, my mind started racing through options. There were no other cars on this stretch of road. It was already past 8 p.m., and this wasn't exactly a busy highway. The nearest house was at least a mile away, and cell service was spotty at best in this area. Logical thoughts battled with my conscience. If I drove past, who knows how long he'd be stranded there. But if I stopped, Natalie's warning echoed in my head. Terminated immediately. For years of steady employment, the mortgage on our modest home, health insurance of my family, even my reputation in town, all on the line because of one decision. With Sarah's part-time job at the library barely covering our groceries, my income was what kept us afloat. I pulled over. Water was streaming down the old man's face when I opened the door. He looked up at me with a mixture of relief and surprise. "Need a ride, sir?" I asked, knowing full well what I was risking. Through chattering teeth, he nodded and began the slow process of climbing aboard. I helped him up the steps, noting how soaked his clothes were. "Where to?" I asked once he was settled. "Just up Cedar Lane, about a mile ahead," he replied, pointing vaguely forward. "I can direct you when we get closer." While pulling back onto the wet asphalt, I glanced in my side mirror. Headlights appeared in the distance behind us. Something tightened in my chest. Was it a company vehicle? Another bus driver who might report me? With the rain streaking down the mirrors, I couldn't tell for sure, but the sense of unease remained. The old man introduced himself as Walter, though I only half listened as my mind was still fixated on those headlights. They stayed behind us for almost a mile before turning off onto a side road. I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. Walter talked about his son and grandkids during our short drive. He had been visiting them, but decided to walk home when the rain seemed to let up earlier. Then the skies opened up again, and there he was, stranded until I came along. As we approached Cedar Lane, Walter pointed to a spot near a cluster of houses. "You can let me off here. My place is just down that way," he said, gesturing toward a cul-de-sac. The rain was still coming down hard, making it difficult to see which house exactly he was heading to. "Are you sure? I can take you right to your door," I offered, concerned about him walking in this weather. No, this is perfect. I've troubled you enough," he insisted. "Besides, the walk would do me good." I wasn't convinced, but I respected his wishes and pulled over where he indicated. That should have been the end of it. A good deed done. Conscience clear, no harm, no foul. I even managed to convince myself during the drive home that nobody would ever know. But as I parked the bus in our neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Those headlights from earlier kept flashing in my mind. What if someone from the company had seen me? What if word got back to Natalie? Little did I know that this single act of kindness was about to unravel my entire life. That picking up Walter would lead me down a path I never could have imagined. One that would test not just my job security, but my entire understanding of right and wrong. I sat in my parked bus for a few minutes, rain drumming on the roof, replaying the evening's events. Had I been followed? Was there a camera I hadn't noticed? The questions kept coming, but answers remained elusive. With a deep breath, I finally turned off the engine and made a dash through the rain to our front door, looking over my shoulder the entire way. The storm masked potential observers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had witnessed my act of kindness, and that there might be consequences. Inside our home, I found Sarah asleep on the couch, likely having dozed off while waiting for me. The kids were tucked in their beds, blissfully unaware of their father's predicament. I drew the blinds and tried to make sense of what was happening. Had I just risked my job over a good deed? How would I tell Sarah if I lost it? Our entire family stability hung in the balance. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, replaying the evening's events. The image of those mysterious headlights kept appearing in my mind. Had someone seen us? Was there a traffic camera I hadn't noticed? The questions kept coming, but answers remained elusive. By morning, I convinced myself I was overreacting. No one had seen anything. No one cared about a school bus driver giving an old man a lift in the rain. This would all blow over. But as I started the bus on my morning route, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That helping Walter had set something in motion I couldn't stop. A chain of events that would test not just my job security, but everything I believed in. Was an act of kindness about to become my downfall? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. There was no going back now. The next morning started like any other. Alarm blaring at 5:30. Kids complaining about having to get up. And Sarah reminding Tyler to please, for the love of God, put on matching socks this time. I went through the motions of our morning routine, but my mind kept drifting back to the old man and those headlights in the rain. By the time I dropped the kids at my mother-in-law's and started my route, I'd almost convinced myself that everything was fine. The kids were their usual chaotic selves. The Marshall twins arguing over who got the good seat at the back, little Aiden showing everyone his missing tooth for the 100th time, and Sophia wearing headphones that weren't even connected to anything just to look cool. Normal. Everything was normal. Until I pulled into the bus depot after my morning route and saw Rita from dispatch waving me down with that look on her face. You know the one. Like she's about to tell you your dog died, but she's not supposed to be the one to break the news. "Kevin," she said, avoiding eye contact. "HR wants to see you. Right now." My stomach dropped. "Did they say what for?" She shook her head. "Just that it's urgent. They're waiting for you in the conference room." The walk to that room felt like the longest of my life. Each step was a countdown to something I wasn't ready to face. When I opened the door, I knew immediately I was in trouble. Natalie Robertson sat at the head of the table, her permanent smile nowhere to be seen. Beside her was Doug Peterson, the regional manager who only showed up when someone was getting fired or when there was free cake in the break room. And to complete the firing squad, Marjorie from HR clutched her tablet like it contained nuclear launch codes. Please have a seat, Kevin, Marjorie said, gesturing to the lone chair facing the three of them. I sat down, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Natalie finally spoke. I'm sure you know why you're here, Kevin. I considered playing dumb but decided against it. If they knew, they knew. I think I might. Doug slid a printed photo across the table. It was grainy, clearly taken from a distance through the rain, but there was no mistaking my bus and the silhouette of an elderly man climbing aboard. Our vehicles have dash cams that activate when the door opens, Natalie explained, her voice clinically detached. They automatically upload footage to our servers. I hadn't even considered the dash cam. For years of driving, and I'd completely forgotten about the silent witness mounted above my head. We have evidence that you transported an unauthorized individual in a company vehicle, Marjorie stated, reading from her tablet. This is a direct violation of Policy 27B, which you signed acknowledgement of 3 months ago during our safety recommitment meeting. I cleared my throat. Look, I understand the policy, but this was an emergency situation. There was an elderly man stranded in the pouring rain. Let me stop you there, Doug interrupted, holding up his hand. The policy doesn't have an exception for what you consider an emergency. It's black and white. No unauthorized passengers. Period. But he was soaking wet, miles from anywhere. What was I supposed to do? Leave him there? Natalie leaned forward. You could have called emergency services. You could have contacted dispatch. You made a choice, Kevin, and that choice was to violate company policy. The conversation continued in this vein for another 10 minutes, me explaining the circumstances, them reiterating policy. It was like arguing with a brick wall that occasionally quoted the employee handbook. Finally, Marjorie slid a document across the table. We value your 4 years of service, Kevin, and we appreciate your humanitarian instinct. However, rules exist for a reason, and we need to enforce them consistently. The heading on the paper read, Termination of Employment. Just like that, for years of my life reduced to a single sheet of paper. My head was spinning. How was I going to tell Sarah? How will we make the mortgage payment next month? How will we afford Emma's braces that we'd finally scheduled for next month? Is there any way we can work this out? A suspension? Probation? I was grasping at straws, and we all knew it. Doug shook his head. I'm afraid our hands are tied. The policy is clear, and we have to apply it equally to everyone. I wanted to scream that there was nothing equal about this, that I was being punished for basic human decency. Instead, I sat there, nodding mechanically as Marjorie explained the exit process. Turn my ID badge, clean out my locker, final paycheck would include vacation time. Benefits would continue until the end of the month. As I stood to leave, I had one last question. How did you get the photo? The dash cam wouldn't have caught that angle. The three exchanged glances before Natalie answered. We received an anonymous tip with the photo attached. Someone saw you pick up the passenger. So someone had been watching. Those headlights had belonged to someone who decided to report me rather than help the old man themselves. Word travels fast in a small town, and by the time I cleaned out my locker, everyone knew. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, suddenly finding their shoelaces fascinating when I walked by. Others offered awkward pats on the back and empty promises to keep an ear out for job opportunities. It was Mark Jeffries who finally said what everyone was thinking. He cornered me in the parking lot as I was loading my things into my car. Tough break, man, he said, jingling his keys nervously. Just so you know, it wasn't me who ratted you out. I looked at him, trying to decide if I believed him. Then who did? He shrugged. Word is, it was someone driving behind you. Recognized the bus number. Took a photo, sent it to management. Some people have nothing better to do, I guess. I drove home in a daze, rehearsing how I would break the news to Sarah. We'd been saving for a down payment on a bigger house. Something with a yard where the kids could actually play without bumping into each other. That dream now seemed as distant as retirement. Sarah was at the kitchen table grading papers when I walked in. One look at my face, and she knew something was wrong. What happened? She asked, setting down her red pen. I told her everything. The old man, the rain, the meeting, the termination. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to anger. They fired you for helping someone? That's insane, she exclaimed when I finished. You've never had a single complaint in 4 years. Apparently, that doesn't matter. Rules are rules. Rules are rules, she mimicked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. What about human decency? What about common sense? The next few hours were a blur of emotions and calculations. We went through our budget line by line, figure out what we could cut, what bills could be delayed. Sarah's part-time teaching job would keep us afloat for a while, but not indefinitely. I'll start looking for something right away, I promised, though we both knew the job market in Millfield was about as lively as a cemetery at midnight. That night, after we tucked the kids in, Sarah and I sat on the porch swing, nursing beers and watching the lightning bugs dance across the yard. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. Picking up that old man? I thought about it for a long moment. No, I finally said. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd just driven past him. Sarah squeezed my hand. That's why I love you. You're a good man, Kevin Parker. Too good for Midwest school transit. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize and a text from my former colleague, Rita. People are talking about what happened. Not everyone agrees with how they treated you. I was scrolling through the calls when the house phone rang. Yes, we still have a landline, mostly because Sarah insists it's important for emergencies. It was my buddy Steve from O'Malley's, who also happened to be a reporter for the local paper. Kevin, my man, I heard what went down at Midwest. Mind if I get your side of the story? I hesitated. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Steve. I need to find a new job, and I don't want to burn bridges. Fair enough, he said, then paused. But just so you know, there's a lot of support for you out there. People are saying you did the right thing, and Midwest overreacted. After we hung up, I checked my email and found a message from an address I didn't recognize. Mr. Parker, I represent a group interested in your recent termination. Please call me at your earliest convenience. The fallout continued throughout the day. Our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, brought over a casserole and told me her church group was praying for us. The cashier at the grocery store slipped me a job application form when I stopped to buy milk. Even Tyler's Little League coach pulled me aside at practice to say his brother-in-law was hiring at his construction company. It was simultaneously heartwarming and humiliating. I appreciated the support, but hated being the subject of town gossip. And underneath it all was a gnawing sense of betrayal. Not just from the company I'd served loyally for years, but from whoever had taken that photo and sent it in, who drives by an elderly man stranded in the rain, doesn't stop to help, but takes the time to photograph someone else helping. What kind of person does that? By dinner time, I was mentally exhausted from fielding calls and messages. Sarah suggested we order pizza, a rare treat in our budget-conscious household, and watch a movie with the kids to take our minds off things. As we sat there, the 4 of us squeezed onto our worn couch. I tried to focus on the animated characters on screen instead of the uncertainty looming over us. Emma leaned against my shoulder, half asleep. Tyler was sprawled across both our laps, completely engrossed in the movie. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness. In that moment, I realized that whatever came next, I still had what mattered most. But the question remained, how would I provide for them now? How would we survive the storm that one act of kindness had unleashed? The movie ended, but our story was just beginning. And somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that the old man I'd helped, Walter, was more than just a stranded stranger. That our paths crossing the rain that night wasn't simply bad luck, but the first link in a chain of events that would change everything. What I didn't know then was just how right I was, and how deep this rabbit hole would go. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sending out resumes, checking job boards, and calling every contact to my phone. 3 weeks of forcing a smile when Emma asked why I was home so much, of assuring Tyler that yes, we could still afford his baseball camp this summer, of pretending to be asleep when Sarah quietly cried beside me at night. The job market in Millfield was exactly what I'd feared, practically non-existent. The factory on the edge of town had laid off workers the previous month. The school district had a hiring freeze. Even the local Walmart wasn't taking applications. The few positions that did open up seemed to vanish before I could even submit my resume. Our savings were dwindling fast. I'd applied for unemployment benefits, but that was barely enough to cover groceries, let alone our mortgage. Sarah had asked for extra classes at the community college where she taught part-time, but they couldn't guarantee anything until the fall semester. I was sitting at our kitchen table, staring at yet another rejection email, when my phone rang. Unknown number. Probably another spam call about my car's extended warranty that I definitely didn't have. I almost didn't answer. But when you're desperate, even spam calls start to seem like potential opportunities. "Hello," I said, not bothering to hide the weariness in my voice. "Hello, is this Kevin Parker?" The voice was elderly, male, and vaguely familiar. "Yes, this is Kevin." "Kevin, this is Walter. The old man you picked up in the rain a few weeks back? I was wondering if we might meet. I have something I'd like to discuss with you." My heart skipped a beat. Walter, the reason I was currently unemployed, but also the person I couldn't bring myself to regret helping. We agreed to meet at Dottie's Cafe the next day at 10 a.m. I spent that night wondering what he could possibly want. Maybe he'd heard about my firing and felt guilty. Maybe he wanted to apologize, though it wasn't really his fault. Or maybe, and this was the paranoid part of my brain talking, he was somehow involved with whoever had reported me. The next morning, I arrived at Dottie's 15 minutes early, partly from anxiety, partly from having nothing better to do. I chose a booth near the back, ordered a coffee I couldn't afford, and waited. At exactly 10 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and in walked Walter. In the daylight, without the rain and desperation, he looked different. He stood straighter, moved with purpose, and was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. This wasn't the helpless old man I'd picked up on the roadside. He spotted me immediately and made his way over, extending his hand. "Kevin, thank you for meeting me." After ordering coffee and insisting on paying for mine, Walter got straight to the point. "I heard about what happened with your job. I want you to know I feel responsible, and I'd like to make it right." I shifted uncomfortably. "It's not your fault. I knew the rules, and I chose to break them." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, you did. You chose basic human decency over corporate policy. That's exactly why I'm here." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "Walter Caldwell, founder and former CEO, Caldwell Transit Solutions." I stared at the card, then back at Walter. Caldwell Transit Solutions was one of the largest private transportation companies in the Midwest. They handled everything from public transit contracts to specialized medical transport. And apparently, I'd given its founder a ride in a school bus. "I retired 5 years ago," Walter explained, stirring his coffee. "Handed the reins over to my son. But I still consult on special projects, and I still have connections throughout the industry." "I don't understand," I said, still trying to process this information. "Why were you walking alone in the rain that night?" Walter smiled. "At my age, you start to appreciate the simple things. I like to walk, and I don't mind the rain. My son worries too much, so sometimes I stretch the truth about where I'm going. That night, I underestimated the weather and found myself farther from home than intended." He leaned forward. "But that's not important. What matters is what happened next. Most people would have driven past. You didn't. That says something about your character, Kevin." My cheeks flushed with embarrassment at the praise. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Walter said firmly. "They wouldn't, and we both know it. That's why I'm offering you a job." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. A job? Where? "In Riverside, the next state over. I have partners there who are expanding their specialized transport services, hospitals, senior communities, disabled services. They need someone to develop and oversee their safety and training programs." I blinked, certain this was some kind of elaborate prank. "You want me to be a safety trainer? I'm just a school bus driver." Was a school bus driver. I corrected myself. Walter shook his head. You're someone who understands that transportation is about people, not just vehicles. Someone who makes the right decision, even when it's difficult. That's the foundation of safety. He pulled out a folder and opened it, revealing what looked like a job description and a salary figure that made my eyes widen. The position is driver instructor and safety coordinator. You develop training protocols, conduct classes for new drivers, and ensure that passenger care is prioritized. The salary is negotiable, but this is our starting offer. I stared at the number on the page. It was nearly double what I'd made at Midwest. This is generous, I managed to say, which was the understatement of the century. Walter waved his hand dismissively. It's the market rate for the responsibility. There's also relocation assistance, health benefits, and a performance bonus structure. My mind was racing. Relocation. We'd have to move, uproot the kids, start over somewhere new. Sarah would need to find a new teaching position. But with a salary like this, we could actually save for the kids' college, maybe even buy a house instead of just dreaming about it. I don't know what to say. I admitted. Say you'll think about it, Walter replied, closing the folder and pushing it toward me. Talk it over with your wife. The position is open for the next 2 weeks, and I've told my associates about you. They're impressed by what they've heard. When I asked what exactly he'd told them, Walter simply smiled. That you're the kind of person who stops for an old man in the rain, even when it might cost you everything. I drove home in a daze, the folder on the passenger seat feeling like a ticket to an alternate reality, where getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. The whole situation seemed surreal. Things like this didn't happen in real life, at least not in my life. When I got home, Sarah was grading papers at the kitchen table, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up when I entered, her expression a mix of hope and hesitation. How did it go? What did he want? I placed the folder in front of her. He offered me a job. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. Kevin, this would change everything. It would mean moving, leaving Millfield, your job, starting over. Sarah looked around our small kitchen, at the worn countertops and the dripping faucet we couldn't afford to fix, at the calendar filled with payment due dates circled in red. Maybe that's exactly what we need, she said quietly. A fresh start. The next few days were a whirlwind of research. We looked up everything we could find about Riverside, the schools, the neighborhoods, the cost of living. We made pro/con lists that always seemed to end with more pros. We cautiously told the kids, who were surprisingly enthusiastic about the adventure of moving somewhere new. Sarah reached out to contacts in education and discovered a charter school in Riverside that was looking for English teachers. She submitted her resume and had a phone interview within days. Meanwhile, I called Walter twice with follow-up questions. Each time, he patiently answered my concerns and reassured me that the offer was genuine. After the second call, he added, Kevin, I'm not doing you a favor. I'm recruiting talent. The fact that I can help someone who helped me is just a bonus. A week after our meeting at Dottie's, Sarah and I sat on our porch swing after kids were in bed, each nursing a beer as we had the night I'd been fired. Do you think we're crazy? I asked, picking up and moving based on one meeting with a stranger. Sarah tilted her head. Is he really a stranger, though? You helped him when he needed it. Now he's helping you when you need it. There's something very human about that exchange. She took my hand, tracing the calluses from years of gripping a steering wheel. Besides, what's our alternative? Stay here, where everyone knows you as the bus driver who got fired, where we're one unexpected expense away from financial disaster. She was right, as usual. Millfield had been our home, but lately it felt more like a cage. The same people who brought casseroles and offered sympathy were now whispering when I walked into the grocery store. The town was too small to rebuild a reputation. Let's do it, I said finally. Let's take the chance. Sarah's smile was equal parts relief and excitement. I'll call the kids' schools tomorrow to start the withdrawal process. 2 weeks later, our house was filled with boxes. Our SUV was packed to the roof, and we were saying goodbye to the only home our children had ever known. My mother-in-law cried and made us promise to video call every Sunday. Our neighbors organized an impromptu farewell barbecue. Even a few of my former colleagues from Midwest showed up to wish us well. As we pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of our house in the rearview mirror. The chip paint on the porch, the maple tree the kids had planted when they were toddlers, the window of the bedroom where Sarah and I had whispered dreams to each other for over a decade. "Dad, are you crying?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice tinged with surprise. "Just something in my eye, honey," I replied, blinking rapidly. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. "It's okay to be sad about what we're leaving behind. It just means it mattered." The drive to Riverside took most of the day. We played license plate bingo, listened to kids' favorite songs until I thought my ears would bleed, and stopped at a roadside diner for lunch where Tyler declared he'd had the best milkshake in the universe. As we crossed the state line, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. No one here knew me as the guy who got fired. No one had seen my humiliation. In Riverside, I would just be Kevin Parker, the new safety coordinator for Specialized Transport Services, a title I was still getting used to saying out loud. We pulled into the extended stay hotel that would be our home until we found a house to rent. The kids immediately claimed the pull-out sofa and began arguing over who would sleep on which side. Sarah started unpacking the essentials we'd need for the night, and I stood in the doorway, watching my family adapt to our new circumstances with resilience that humbled me. The next morning, I put on my only suit, slightly wrinkled from being packed, and headed to the address Walter had given me. The building was modern, all glass and steel, with Specialized Transport Services emblazoned on the front in bold letters. Inside, I was greeted by a receptionist who seemed to be expecting me. "Mr. Parker, welcome to STS. Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you in the conference room." Mr. Caldwell, Walter's son, the current CEO of Caldwell Transit Solutions, and, apparently, a partner in this venture. He stood when I entered, a man in his 40s with Walter's eyes and a firm handshake. "Kevin, I'm Robert Caldwell. My father has told me a lot about you." The meeting that followed was unlike any job interview I'd ever had. Instead of grilling me on my qualifications, Elaine asked about my philosophy on passenger care, my ideas for training programs, and my thoughts on balancing safety with efficiency. By the end of our conversation, I had signed an employment contract, received a company laptop and phone, and been given a tentative start date for following Monday. As Robert walked me out, he paused in the lobby. "You know, my father doesn't often take a personal interest in recruitment. In fact, this is the first time in years he's brought someone directly to me. You must have made quite an impression." That night, we celebrated with pizza and ice cream in our hotel room. The kids were giddy with excitement over the pool they discovered, and Sarah couldn't stop talking about her upcoming interview with the charter school. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of New City, I thought about how drastically our lives had changed in just a few short weeks. From the brink of financial ruin to the beginning of something potentially better than anything we'd had before. All because I'd stopped to help an old man in the rain. It seemed too good to be true, this sudden reversal of fortune. Part of me was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to reveal that this was all an elaborate mistake. But another part, the part that had made me stop the bus that rainy night, wanted to believe that sometimes good things happen to good people, that kindness, even when it seems to cost you everything, might be the very thing that leads you exactly where you need to go. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't the end of my unexpected journey. It was just the beginning. And Walter Caldwell had more in mind for me than simply training bus drivers. My first day at Specialized Transport Services was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool after only ever splashing around in the kiddie section. The office they gave me had an actual door that closed, not just a cubicle with walls that stopped 3 feet short of the ceiling. My new desk didn't wobble when I leaned on it, and my chair had more than 2 adjustment settings. It was surreal. Robert Caldwell introduced me to the management team that morning, explaining that I'd be developing their driver training program from scratch. "Kevin brings a perspective we need," he told them. "Someone who understands that transportation isn't just about moving bodies from point A to point B. It's about caring for the people inside those vehicles." Some of the managers nodded along enthusiastically. Others gave me that skeptical side-eye that clearly said, "Great, another idealist who doesn't understand the bottom line." I was used to that look. I'd seen it plenty of times at Midwest when I suggested things like, maybe we should have working heaters on the buses in winter. The first few weeks were a blur of learning curves, so steep they might as well have been vertical. I had to familiarize myself with regulations for medical transport, accessibility requirements for different disabilities, and protocols for handling everything from oxygen tanks to service animals. The amount of paperwork involved made the school district look positively minimalist. But for the first time in my career, I had real authority. When I suggested changes, people actually listened. When I pointed out safety concerns, they weren't dismissed with "we'll look into it," which was corporate speak for "we're going to ignore this until someone sues us." I spent my days observing current drivers, riding along on shifts, and taking notes on what worked and what didn't. I noticed that many drivers treated their elderly or disabled passengers like cargo. Not cruelly, just indifferently. A quick "watch your step" was the extent of their interaction, followed by silent drives and hasty goodbyes. By month 2, I developed my first training module focused on passenger interaction. I called it the human touch. The title made a few of the drivers snicker during the inaugural session, but I pressed on. Look, I told the group of 20 drivers staring back at me with expressions ranging from boredom to mild interest, I get it. You're focused on the road, on schedules, on safety checklists. But for many of our passengers, you're not just their driver. You might be the only person they speak to that day. I showed them research on isolation among seniors and people with disabilities. I brought in photos of our regular passengers and shared bits of their life stories that I'd learned during my ride-alongs. Mrs. Abernathy isn't just a 10:15 pickup to St. Luke's Hospital every Tuesday. She's a former kindergarten teacher who taught for 42 years. She has 3 grandchildren she doesn't see often because they live out of state, and she's terrified of medical appointments because her husband died during a routine procedure 5 years ago. One of the drivers in the back, a gruff ex-trucker named Lloyd, raised his hand. "With all due respect, Kevin, we've got schedules to keep. We can't be stopping for life stories at every pickup." I'd expected this pushback. "I'm not asking you to be their therapist, Lloyd. I'm asking you to see them as people, not appointments. A simple, 'How are you today, Mrs. Abernathy?' while you're securing her wheelchair can make all the difference in her day. And it takes exactly the same amount of time as saying nothing." The skepticism didn't disappear overnight. I heard the whispers around the break room. "Parker thinks he's running a hospitality service, not a transportation company, and all this touchy-feely stuff is cutting into our turnaround times." Even some of the management team questioned my approach. During one particularly tense meeting, the operations manager, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, challenged me directly. "These feel-good measures are all well and good, Kevin, but let's talk numbers. We've seen a 7% decrease in daily completed trips since your training program began." I'd anticipated this. "Yes, and if you look at page 3 of my report, you'll see we've also had a 15% decrease in incident reports, a 23% reduction in passenger complaints, and a 30% increase in positive feedback forms." Robert, who had been silently observing from the head of the table, finally spoke up. "And what about the contract renewals?" Diane shuffled through her papers. "Up 12% from this time last year." "I believe that answers the question," Robert said with a small smile. "Continue, Kevin." Slowly but surely, the culture began to shift. Drivers who initially rolled their eyes at my excessive focus on passenger care started to see the benefits. Lloyd, my biggest skeptic, was the first surprising convert. He stopped me in the hallway about 2 months after that first training session. "You know that old guy I pick up on Wednesdays? Mr. Savino? Turns out he worked counterintelligence during the Cold War. Has some wild stories." Lloyd looked almost embarrassed by his enthusiasm. "Anyway, just thought you want to know your program's not complete garbage after all." Coming from Lloyd, this was practically a declaration of undying support. The feedback from passengers was even more gratifying. Letters started coming in, specifically mentioning drivers by name and thanking them for their kindness. Our reputation in the community grew, and with it, our client base. By the 6-month mark, we had expanded our fleet by 3 vehicles and hired 5 new drivers, all of whom went through my now refined training program. Robert began sending me to industry conferences to speak about our approach to specialized transport. A year into my new position, Walter invited Sarah and me to dinner at his home, a beautiful, understated mansion on the outskirts of town that somehow managed to be both impressive and welcoming. His son Robert was there with his wife, along with a few other business associates I'd met in passing. After dinner, Walter asked me to join him in his study, a wood-paneled room lined with books that smelled pleasantly of leather and pipe tobacco. He poured 2 glasses of scotch and handed one to me. "I've been watching your progress, Kevin," he said, settling into a leather armchair that had probably cost more than my first car. "You've exceeded every expectation." I felt my face flush with pride. "Just doing my job, Walter." "No, you're redefining what the job should be. And that's why I've asked you here tonight." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid across to me. "I want to offer you a partnership stake in STS." I nearly choked on my scotch. "A partnership? But I've only been with the company for a year." Walter nodded. "A year in which revenue has increased by 22%. Client retention is an all-time high, and we've expanded into 2 neighboring counties. Your approach works, Kevin, and I want to make sure you have the incentive to keep innovating." The papers in the folder outlined a 15% ownership stake in specialized transport services, with options to increase that percentage based on performance metrics over the next 5 years. The potential financial implications made my head spin. "This is incredibly generous," I said, still trying to wrap my head around what was happening. Walter shook his head. "It's not generosity. It's smart business. You have a vision for this company that aligns perfectly with what Robert and I want to build. People come first. Profit follows. It's a philosophy many in the industry have forgotten." As I drove home that night, documents safely tucked in my briefcase, I couldn't help but marvel at how much my life had changed in just over a year, from being fired in disgrace to becoming a partner in a thriving business. It was like a plot twist in one of those inspirational movies Sarah loved to watch on Sunday afternoons. Speaking of Sarah, she'd found her own success in Riverside. The charter school had hired her almost immediately, and within 6 months, she'd been promoted to department head for English. The kids had adapted to their new schools with the resilience that still amazed me, making friends, joining activities, and rarely mentioning Millfield except when talking to their grandmother on our weekly video calls. We'd bought a house in a neighborhood with sidewalks wide enough for bike riding and trees old enough to climb. It wasn't massive or fancy, but it was ours, and for the first time, we weren't stretching every paycheck to cover the mortgage. Life was good, better than good. It was the kind of life we talked about having someday back in our tiny kitchen in Millfield, the someday that had always seemed just out of reach, and all because I'd stopped for an old man in the rain. It was around this time that news from Millfield started trickling in through old contacts and social media. Steve, my reporter friend from O'Malley's, was the first to call with the gossip. "Thought you'd want to know," he said without preamble when I answered my phone one Saturday morning. "Natalie Robertson got the boot from Midwest School Transit last week." I paused in the middle of making pancakes for the kids. "No kidding? What happened?" Remember those efficiency protocols she was so gung-ho about? Turns out she was enforcing them selectively. Some drivers were allowed to make unauthorized stops if they were her favorites. When the higher-ups found out, they sacked her faster than you can say hypocrite. A part of me felt vindicated. The same person who had so coldly enforced rules against me had been bending them for others all along. But another part just felt tired. The anger I'd carried about my firing had faded, replaced by a recognition that it had ultimately led me somewhere better. "What about Mark?" I asked, remembering the colleague who'd sworn he wasn't the one who'd reported me. Still there, still driving the same route, still complaining about the same kids. Steve chuckled. Some things never change. More updates followed over the coming months. The Midwest School Transit contract with the district wasn't renewed, replaced by a competitor that promised better maintenance of their fleet. Something I'd been harping on for years. The school superintendent who had backed Natalie's zero-tolerance policies retired under a cloud of controversy involving misappropriated funds. It was strange watching the dominoes fall from a distance, like observing a storm that had once threatened to destroy me now passing harmlessly over a town I no longer lived in. Sarah found me looking at Facebook updates from Millfield one evening, scrolling through photos of a town fundraiser where I recognized many faces. "Do you miss it?" she asked, settling beside me on the couch. I considered the question carefully. Not the place. Maybe some of the people. Definitely not the job. She rested her head on my shoulder. "It's funny how things work out, isn't it? If they hadn't fired you, we'd still be there. I finished, still struggling to make ends meet, still putting off the things we wanted to do. Someday." That night, I found myself reflecting on the strange path that had led us here. If I hadn't been fired, I'd never have met Walter in his true capacity, never have discovered my talent for training and developing programs that put people first, never have become part owner of a successful business. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of something far better. I thought back to that rainy night, to the split-second decision to stop for Walter. At the time, it had seemed like such a simple choice. Help someone who needed it. I couldn't have possibly known how that one moment of basic human decency would ripple outward, changing everything. Sometimes I wondered about the person who had taken that photo, who had reported me. Had they known what they were setting in motion? Had they meant to hurt me? Or were they just following rules like I had refused to do? Whoever they were, whatever their motivation, I found I couldn't be angry anymore. Their act of betrayal had inadvertently pushed me toward a door I would never have found otherwise. 2 years after moving to Riverside, Walter invited me to speak at the annual conference for the American Transport Association. It was a big deal. Industry leaders from across the country would be there, and I'd be presenting our passenger-centered approach as a keynote. The night before my speech, I was a nervous wreck, revising my slides for the 20th time when Walter knocked on my hotel room door. "May I come in?" he asked, looking as calm and collected as always. I gestured him inside, embarrassed by the scattered notes and empty coffee cups littering the desk, just making some last-minute adjustments. Walter smiled. "The speech will be fine, Kevin. You know this material better than anyone. There'll be over 300 people out there tomorrow," I said, unable to keep the anxiety from my voice. "Yes," Walter agreed. 300 people who need to hear what you have to say, who need to be reminded that this industry is about more than vehicles and schedules. It's about the people we serve." He paused, fixing me with that penetrating gaze of his. "Do you know why I chose you, Kevin? That night in the rain?" The question caught me off guard. "You didn't exactly choose me. I stopped for you." Walter shook his head. "I could have called my driver. I could have called my son. I had options, but when I saw that school bus approaching, I decided to take a chance, to see if the driver would stop, even though I knew the policies most districts have. I stared at him, processing this new information. "You were testing me?" "Not testing," Walter corrected. "Observing. In 40 years in this business, I've learned that how people act when no one is watching, or when rules tell them not to act, reveals their true character." He smiled gently. "You passed with flying colors, Kevin. And look where it's led you." Standing at the podium the next day, looking out at a sea of industry professionals, I thought about what Walter had said, about choices and character, and the unexpected doors they can open. I thought about Natalie Robertson, so focused on rules that she missed their purpose. I thought about Mark, still driving the same route, living the same life. I thought about myself, the person I'd been in Millfield, and the person I'd become in Riverside. And as I began my speech about putting humanity back into human transportation, I realized something profound. Sometimes, what feels like betrayal is actually the universe redirecting you to where you're meant to be. The company that had fired me had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of my life. The person who had reported me had unknowingly set me on a path to success I never could have imagined. In the end, I hadn't just rebuilt my career. I'd found my purpose. All because I refused to drive past an old man in the rain. Sometimes, The worst moments of our lives turn out to be the best things that ever happened to us. And sometimes a simple act of kindness can change everything, not just for the person you help, but for yourself as well.